It's my pleasure to introduce Sir Paul. I first met him through Elder Clifford Herbertson in Area 70 in London when I was representing BYU at the London Center there as academic director. And Elder Herbertson arranged, he said, there's this man you should meet. And to be honest, I'm always slightly leery of people I should meet, because that usually means that there's something that I'm supposed to put up, right? It's not usually supposed to be to my advantage. So we arranged lunch, and we had lunch, several of us, and talked about his work and ours, and I have to say I was most impressed with him and his organization, and unlike the case in many such instances, I left the meeting thinking, there really is something that we can cooperate on here. There really is something we both can get out of this. This isn't just someone who's come to ask me for money. But Sir Paul Coleridge is the founder and the chairman of the Marriage Foundation in the UK. He established that in 2012. The purpose of the foundation is to confront the scourge of family breakdown by championing long-lasting, stable relationships within marriage, something that frankly has become less and less common here and in the UK and in many places. Previous to this work that he began in 2012, he served in the British judicial system from 1970 to 2014. In 2000, he was knighted and appointed as a judge in the British High Court of Justice, specializing in family law and mediations, and it's his experience there that led him to create the foundation. He was educated at the Cranleigh School and later attended the School of Law at London University. He was admitted to the bar in 1970. He and his wife, Lisa, have 3 children. So I give you Sir Paul.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Jim. It's absolutely fabulous to be here. We've had a wonderful few days, and we've got more to come. Thank you also, Richard, for this afternoon. Is he here? He's gone. It was a wonderful afternoon. It was a fabulous lecture this afternoon. He referred to the people who can make a difference as what he called the little platoons. We are one of the little platoons, Marriage Foundation, although we'd like to get rather bigger and perhaps become a regiment one of these days. But at the moment we are very much a little platoon, and we are determined to make a difference. The other expression he used this afternoon, which I shall borrow and use when I get the opportunity, is that he said there was too much carelessness about the fate of the family, and we had allowed this to grow and become a serious problem, and I totally supported what he said. The title of my talk to you this evening is Marriage Unapologetic, a Marriage Foundation, what for? Like Richard, I like titles. And these are 2 of my titles. Marriage Foundation has the double entendre. It's meant to convey 2 things. One, obviously, a public charitable trust, like you have many of in this country, and like we have in the UK. That is its primary meaning. But of course, marriage is the foundation of all of society, wherever civilized society is found anywhere on the globe. Marriage is at its center and always has been for millennia. So I was rather proud of that title, and people very often say to me, you should change the name, because marriage now, as Robert was saying this afternoon, marriage has a toxic flavor to it, and you don't want to have that in your title. You want to have a catchy name, like championing children or something like that, and I won't have it. Our organization is about marriage, and we are unapologetic about that. And this evening I want to talk about the apologetics, if I can use the other meaning of the term, the apologetics of marriage. But I can only really start in one place, and that is with a huge and sincere thank you for your invitation to come here from Britain and to speak to this fabulous institution. I've learnt so much this afternoon. The work you do makes me green with envy. Green with envy. I'm amazed by your facilities, as one so often is when one comes to this great country, but the work you're doing and the subjects you're covering in such a thorough way is, as I say, if you can find another benefactor who could do the same for us in Britain, please put him in touch with me. But you've been a support to us, as Jim has said, since its very creation, and I was very honoured in 2013 to be presented at the House of Commons in London with one of your Family Values Awards, and since then we have worked together with Brigham Young, with Spencer James, who came to England in 2016 and worked with our main researcher, and that's been a very, very fruitful cooperation, and I think is still going on. I'm constantly being told by Harry Benson, our research man, I've been talking to Spencer again, and he and it's becoming routine now, and it's terrifically helpful to us. So it's both an honour and a pleasure to visit here this evening. And I just give you one little small anecdote, is that my son is the vicar of the church which is nearest to the Brigham Young London base in Palace Gardens. He's just round the corner in the huge church nearby. And Jim it was, I think, who asked me whether it would be possible for Brigham Young students to go and spend an afternoon there from time to time to hear about the background to this extraordinary church, which is as large as a cathedral almost, which my son took over 5 years ago. And so there's been this crossover of ideas there for over the last 3 years. And I had a text from him 2 days ago to say, I have just had another group of students from Brigham Young University for the afternoon. So he was in London talking to Brigham Young, and I am in Utah talking to Brigham Young. So we have a strong connection. Thank you very much. As with the case for Christianity, marriage can be justified by reference either to biblical text or hard, rigorous science, whichever you prefer. And I'm not going to spend this evening talking about biblical text, because there are people in this room who would be able to do it far better than I. It is only necessary, of course, to remind you that from the very first chapter of the Bible, indeed almost the first page, to the very last, the centrality of marriage and the husband and wife relationship to the whole of humanity pervades the text. You know all the quotations. Our relationship to God, to Christ, to each other is in the end a quasi-matrimonial one, with all the implications that that adjective conveys. But in the same way that in most cases it is impossible to convince people of the truths of Christianity by saying, pick up your Bible and read what it says, if only it was as easy as that. By the same token, we have found it is quite impossible in a secular environment to convince people of the uniqueness of marriage by saying it is God-inspired and God-fashioned. So Marriage Foundation's primary task is, and always has been and will remain, to support the case without reference to the religion or the Bible, but only by reference to hard, statistically supported and research-based fact, as we would call it. And surprise, surprise, when you take that rather more scenic route, you come to the unswerving conclusion that the God-designed model, when it is not horribly distorted by cultural overlay, and we all know that in some cultures marriage is not what it might be, and has an enormous amount of cultural difficulty which causes unhappiness. When it's not distorted by a cultural overlay, it works the best for the human race. I became a convinced Christian myself because I was persuaded that it was basically true from a historical point of view, and because I was convinced that Christianity works in the sense that it works in your life for you as on an experiential basis. So if I may detain you for a little now, I intend unapologetically to attempt to put the marriage apologetic, and in so doing I hope that you will agree too that it is indeed true and it does indeed work. Let us start at the beginning. Who is this person who is talking to you this afternoon? This evening. This is important. What is my authority for talking about what I intend to talk about? And the answer is that I have spent the whole of my working life as a lawyer in the British family justice system. I started in 1971 specializing in family law as a barrister, and that carried on until 2000. In 1993 they saw fit to appoint me a Queen's Counsel, which simply means a senior counsel to do the more serious cases, and in 2000 I was invited to be a High Court judge in the family court. And it was while I was working as a judge that I became convinced that we needed to do something about the huge increase in family breakdown that I had experienced during the previous 30 years. I remind you that in 1971, when I started, the term cohabitation did not exist. It was not in anybody's vocabulary. Nobody lived together unmarried. It didn't happen. Our own basic divorce statute has nowhere mentions that expression in any way, and nor is the concept included in any way at all. So we have no statute law that governs as it were, the unmarried who live together. So it was a minority problem. Divorce was running at about 15 to 20% back then, and it was a problem, but it was a contained problem, and we could live with it. By the time I got to set up the foundation in 2012, we were in the middle of this tsunami of family breakdown, and we will unpack the causes of it in a moment. But just before I do that, I always like to give a sort of health warning, and the health warning is this. When you're discussing this subject, if you're going to make any headway, you can't do it by adopting a preaching standpoint. It doesn't work. Would that it did, but it doesn't. It's most important that those of us who feel passionately about this subject approach it in as calm and cool a way as possible, and in as rational a way as possible. Otherwise, we lose the argument before it started. Now, it is very easy for those of us who have been lucky enough to have a fulfilling marriage that's lasted, in my case, more than 4 decades, to assume that this is something that everybody agrees about. But they don't. And as I say, one has to be humble when discussing this problem, particularly because almost certainly, although I suspect not in this audience, whenever I speak about this subject in any kind of mixed environment, you can be sure that most of the people in the room have experienced first-hand family breakdown for themselves, either in their own families or indirectly amongst their friends, colleagues, people at school, people at college, wherever. And it is a very, very tricky and difficult area to talk about without sounding judgmental. But we mustn't do that. We must remain rational, sympathetic, and humble when discussing this most appalling of problems. So the essential question that we have to grapple with, really, is this: is marriage relevant today? And if so, is it worth trying to do something to strengthen and support it? Would that be of benefit to us all, or only those who are now happily married and don't like people shaking the foundations of their quiet life by living in unstructured relationships? And the short answer, as far as we're concerned, is if it doesn't benefit society, then there's no point in supporting it. In other words, not just because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If society wants to develop in a different way and it doesn't hurt anybody, it's pointless, as we all know, trying to stand in the way of so-called social progress. So do we have a problem with family life and family breakdown which would be ameliorated by supporting marriage? Why do we want a marriage foundation then? And the simple answer is contained in what is called our elevator pitch, and you all know what elevators are. We don't in London, of course, know what an elevator is. I have to explain in a rather pedestrian way what an elevator pitch is, but of course you know what an elevator pitch is. The only difference between an elevator pitch here and in London, of course, is that the elevators go much higher so the pitches can be longer. Family breakdown, with its appalling pain and distress, is at epidemic levels and lies at the root of almost all society's problems. Ponder that remark. Think of any of the real problems of society at the moment and trace them back, and they nearly always have their root in disrupted families of some kind. It particularly affects our children. It is a primary cause of inequality. Think about that too. People don't very often say that, but as I will demonstrate to you later, family breakdown affects the less well-off far worse than the sort of people who are in this room. And so, along with everything else, they have to cope with terrible levels of family breakdown, and it fuels inequality. It costs £48 billion a year to the national exchequer. Now, I haven't seen what the figure is in the US. I suspect you could easily put a naught at the end of that. It would be very interesting to know, and if it is not a figure that you collate each year, then I would suggest that that is work that should be done, because it's the one thing that cuts in with politicians. If you can explain to them that this is costing the country a fortune in hard-earned taxpayers' money, they just stop to think a little bit longer. It's the one area that we have found, and we publish this figure through our sister organization. Every single year we bring out a new figure which updates the old figure, and we always have controversy about how we compile it, but it's absolutely there for all to see, and it's all the obvious things. If you can get that figure and ram it down the throats of the politicians, you do find they take note. So reversing the current declining rate of marriage is ultimately the single most effective key to reducing family breakdown, because even nowadays, most marriages last a lifetime, whereas less formal partnerships don't. And lifelong fulfilling marriage remains the main aspiration of the majority, especially the young, but is now regarded as unattainable. And the single most important factor in a child's healthy development is the stable, note the word stable, not happy, is the stable relationship of the parents, and on every measure of successful development, including happiness, children from stable families fare best. Such stability is invariably found within marriage. By the age of 16, 50% of our children in the UK do not live with both their birth parents, but they are 3 times more likely to do so if their parents are married. So in terms of the risk, if you're a young person in the audience today, if you remember nothing else from this lecture, remember that the risk to your relationship collapsing if you do not marry and you live with someone and have children is measured at 3+ times. We'll have a look at some of the more hard statistics in a minute about what actually has gone on in the last few years, but the risk is 3 times greater, and that is a huge risk. Married couples are far less likely to break up than couples who live together without getting married, even after adjusting for the influence of such factors as income, age, and education. Data shows that 8% of married parents, compared to 43% of unmarried, had separated before their child's 5th birthday. Empirical evidence shows that intact marriages tend to provide more beneficial outcomes for adults and children than cohabitation or single parenthood. Children tend to do better in areas of physical, emotional health, educational achievement, financial security, and their ability to form their own future stable families, and that, of course, is vital. This problem feeds from one generation to the next, and that is what I used to see over and over again in the family justice system. You would see the parents, you would often see in the most extreme cases, the most extreme children cases, we would have what I call double-decker cases. So we would have the 16-year-old being taken away from her parents, but she was pregnant herself already with a child which would have to be removed as well. So it's that awful business of it compounding through the generations. And despite this clear evidence, there has been a lamentable lack of active government and parliamentary support for marriage, and I'll come back to that later. Now, I'm not going to blind you all with figures this evening because there are millions of them. Spencer's in the audience, he might come up later and give us a few more. But we're always producing them, there's tons of them, and they all tend to say the same thing. But let me give you just the basic picture. In 2010 in UK, 241,000 marriages, 248,000 in 2012, so a little bit of a blip. Anybody like to guess what that was caused by? It's not a million miles from Downton Abbey. It was the royal wedding that year. We think that was probably gave it a little bit of a blip. There was a bit of bling flying about. 40,854 in 13, a small decrease. The decline ends the steady rise recorded between the recent low in 2009 and a peak in 2012, 47,000 in 2014, again a slight increase. So we've had a zigzag, but it's actually pretty stable. I mean, in statistical terms, we don't have a real problem over the rate of marriage. It's pretty stable. It's not anywhere near high enough, but it's stable. But 2.1 million cohabiting couples in 2001, rising to 2.9 in 2011, and on the current trajectory we think 3.7 or thereabouts by 2030. And that is where the problems lie. Now let us look just quickly at the question of divorce. As I said to you earlier, when I started in 1970, 22% of marriages ended in divorce within 15 years. By 1995, that same figure had risen to 33%, a 50% increase. The divorce rate, as it is now described, is hovering at around about 40%. It's not a terribly, funnily enough, although the newspapers always take this figure, it's not a very useful figure. It's a very much an average mean figure to say 40%. It's much more instructive to look at the length of marriages and when the breakdowns occur. And but if we have to have a figure to make it simple for the public, it's running at about 41%, which of course is disastrously high. But this is the key problem. The percentage of couples with dependent children, look at them, the two pie charts. The married population make up 81%, and the cohabiting population make up 19%, in other words, about a fifth of the couples with dependent children. But in terms of the chaos they produce, the cohabiting population produce almost exactly the same as the married population, and they are only 1/5 as big. And that is really the nub of the problem we have, is that cohabitation is essentially unstable for reasons we will look at in a moment. And this is the development of the point I made earlier, that the rate of breakdown amongst parents before at a particular given time after birth of the first child, and the top line, the blue one, are the cohabitants. And look at the difference between the rate of breakdown amongst the people on the blue line and the rate of breakdown on the people on the red line at the bottom, which is the people who were married at the birth of their first child. There's a huge difference. And then that interesting middle line, which was a line we first discovered through our research, which is that there is a difference between the stability of a relationship where the couple are married before they have their children and a couple who get married after. And it seems that they are less, if you marry having had a child, there is greater instability, 6 times more likely to break up before the child's 5th birthday. So we have the basic position that 45% of our young teenagers do not live with their both parents. Every year, and this is what I used to see, 500,000 children get caught up in the family justice system, which is measured in terms of the huge exchange tent we have on the edge of the Thames in London. There are over 3 million children in the family justice system as we speak here today, and that is because, as anybody who has been involved in family justice knows, if you get involved in the family justice system with a complicated case, it isn't a one-hearing job. You can once you become involved in the family justice system, these disputes run on. Often they run on for years. I think the record I had was 9 years. Of course, the lawyers all got fat on it. But the fact is that once these cases become intractable, they can remain in and out of the system for a very, very long time, and it's terribly expensive of time, judicial time, court time, and of course it's devastating for the people who take part. And then back to the figure I mentioned earlier, the £48 billion a year, which is more than our entire defence budget. And it goes up inexorably, year by year. When I started this 5 years ago, I think the figure was around about 42, so it's now 48. So it's climbing. And that is despite government attempts to cut back on the expenditure of family breakdown. I'll give you one example. In fact, the one that really, in the end, got me out of my chair to do something about was when they decided that the cost of legal provision for people going through family breakdown was just going through the roof. It's costing billions every year in providing lawyers for people to argue in the courts. And so the government had the extraordinarily enlightened idea that the easiest way of cutting that was simply to say you can't have it. So all of a sudden, literally within 6 months, they cut off all funding for matrimonial, for disputes involving family breakdown without any warning other than, as I say, telling us that that was going to happen. It was like, as I used to, and it was that got me talking about this in a public way. I said, you can't do this. The people going through the worst emotional stress of their life, you simply cannot refuse them access to a lawyer at this time in their lives. They need it more than any other time. And in order to, and I made this point in a speech to the main annual conference of the family lawyers in London, but in order to emphasize what I was saying, I told them about the state of family life and the state of family breakdown in the UK. That was on the front page of one of the main tabloids the following morning. They weren't really interested in the fact that lawyers were no longer going to be paid. What they were interested in is High Court judge says we are in the middle of a catastrophe of family breakdown, and it was that which started the ball rolling. I shall learn to keep my mouth shut in future. Now, just to give you a little bit of light relief, I very often ask people if they we'll have a little quiz now, and we'll ask you to identify the people in the photographs. But it does have a semi-serious point, this. Celebrity family breakdown, as we call it, runs at about twice the national average for ordinary couples, okay? And it is important, this, because these people, the celebs, are the people who influence our children. People want to emulate the celebrity lifestyle, and they think it's, if they find someone that's glamorous and exciting, that will be a key to a long, happy and stable relationship. Of course, nothing could be further than the truth, and the reality is that celebrities go through the pain of family breakdown much, much more frequently than us lesser mortals with feet of clay. We carried out this research with the help of a wonderful barrister whose hobby was to spend her spare time combing through those ridiculous celebrity magazines, listing people who were showcased each week in these magazines, and she did it. She went back 3 years and got them all, and we decided that our definition for celebrity, because of course it's a make-up, our definition of celebrity was someone who appeared in one of these magazines more than twice in 2 years. So this was the basis of our research, and it got a lot of publicity. Now, this is a very important piece of serious research that was done not by us, but by a professor of law at Warwick University back in 2013. One of the problems with this whole debate is that it's riddled with myths that people have because of their own anecdotal experience, nearly always, and it's very rarely very based on serious, hard data and research. Now, this is research that was carried out by this professor in order to deal with the myth that has been prevalent in the UK for quite a time, which is that cohabitation has been common in our society for hundreds of years. And the only difference now is that we talk about it, whereas before we didn't. She is an academic, she has no axe to grind, but she was unhappy about that from her own historical research, and she spent 10 years, and I don't exaggerate because I went to the presentation when she produced this for her book, which she wrote on the subject. She spent 10 years combing all the birth records and birth registers for the whole of the UK, which you can now do digitally without having to go outside and put your coat on, because you can do it on your computer. And she discovered something quite interesting, which was that the rate of cohabitation in this country was running at around about 5% and had been since 1600, Shakespeare's day, okay? Sir Walter Raleigh, all that stuff, the Spanish Armada. It was running at about 5%. In fact, it was very, very unusual. And she did this by tracing, as I say, the birth records. And then suddenly she came across this extraordinary finding, which was that statistic, that level of cohabitation, had remained the same until about 1980. And then in 1980, well, you can see, it took off. And that's where we find this huge increase in cohabitation. And I remember it as a barrister so well that suddenly, for no apparent reason, enormous numbers of people were coming through the family justice system who weren't married. For the first 10 years of my practice, you didn't see people cohabiting. There was an expression which went around a bit, which was living in sin. People used to say it rather quietly behind their hands. I do know they're living in sin. I mean, nowadays it sounds like something from Noah's Ark, but that is what people, it didn't happen. And then it started happening. I don't think you would take very long to guess what caused it. It was almost certainly the arrival on the scene of the contraceptive pill. And that, of course, changed the entire sexual behavior of a generation. I always say, of course, I missed it. I was always too late. But the fact is, it changed the sexual behavior of people, and then the chicken and egg began. So people did begin living together because they no longer feared pregnancy. And because they were living together, they started having children, and it just became the norm. And no one for a moment intended it. It was one of those classic cases of the law of unintended consequences. No one thought it, no one expected it to happen, but that is what, that is the truth, and that is what this, this interesting slide shows. And if you were to do a slide for the rate of family breakdown, you would find it fitted neatly on top of that. That is when our problems really took off. Now let me show you another picture which I like to show people, particularly when there's a lot of young people in the audience. If you get married today, the fact is that you will probably, in terms of probabilities, remain married for the rest of your life. In other words, 60% of newlyweds can expect to marry for life. Now, if you're trying to promote long-term marriage as we are, what you want to show is what a wonderful consolation it is. The difficulty is that in order to show people who've had the happy experience of long-term marriage, they have to be rather collapsed like me. And so this is to epitomize the problem. We have a couple of lovely Russian peasants, and they are the problem we have, demonstrating the beauty, if you like, of long-term marriage does not bring the celebrities onto your screen. So there we have it. Today you have a 50-50 chance of being with your parents by the time you're 15. And this is perhaps the only other figure you need to remember from today. If the sad fact is, as I say, that half of all children are no longer living with their birth parents by the age of 15, when they're young teenagers, when they need their parents' support more than anything else. But if you take the half that are, 93% are married, 7% are not, 7% are cohabiting. So what does that tell you? It means that you have virtually no chance of being with your parents if they are not married by the time you are 15. You have this minute proportion of people who live with unmarried parents. And then we very often have this question that very often asked, and it may get asked today: are you suggesting, therefore, that cohabiting parents do a worse job than the married parents? And the answer to that question is subject to one point, which I will come to in a minute, and which Spencer will know what I'm going to say. Subject to one point, the answer is we're not saying that. We're not saying that the cohabiting parents are any worse as parents per se, but they don't exist. They don't exist at a time when your children most need you, which is in their mid-teens. There are very, very few of them around in intact relationships. So it's not a question of qualitative parenting, it's a question of stability. And then we have this, this I think, quite sad statistic, really, which is that 3/4 of 20 to 24-year-olds say they want to marry. That was some research that was carried out by another organization, not ours, in 2008. We have very recently repeated that polling, and done by the Center for Social Justice, a very respected organization that does a lot of very good polling. We very recently repeated it for the purposes of the Conservative Party conference, which I attended 2 weeks ago, and it's still the same. There's been no change on that at all. But it isn't all doom and gloom. There's some good figures as well. There has been a 29% decrease in divorces granted to couples in the first 5 years of marriage. And this is very, very important, which is why I say looking at a simple statistic like 40% doesn't really tell you very much. Almost all divorce is concentrated in the early years. So to see a very considerable decrease in divorces granted to couples in the first 5 years, year by year, and as you see it's dropped for 8 consecutive years, is a very encouraging sign. Why is it happening? Of course, no one knows for certain, but we think it's because people marry later. The very latest statistics, which I actually got by email while I was here, shows that that figure has continued to, for the early years marriage, has continued to fall again this year. So it is now 9 years that the early years marriages have decreased, and I think that is a good sign. Almost all variation comes in the first 10 years. For couples who've been married for more than 10 years, the divorce rate has not changed significantly since the 1960s. I bet you didn't know that. Isn't that interesting? Again, a great myth. That if you get to 10 years, which is the first 10 years are the toughest because obviously the arrival of children, then your chances of getting divorced fall away dramatically. We have a kind of what we call a ski slope. It falls right away and continues to do so year on year. After 10 years, the divorce rate is 1.8, and it drops away year by year. And if you make it till 30 years or more, you're overwhelmingly likely to go on, well, as the English prayer book says, till death us do part, but I know you would take issue with that. But you're likely to remain married is the short answer. So what can we do? Well, there are 3 areas which call for our attention. Funnily enough, very interesting what Robert was saying this afternoon. In the end, it's about our own behavior. You can blame the institutions, you can blame all sorts of attitudes, but it's us, isn't it? It's like people blame the banks for the collapse in 2008. It wasn't the banks, it was the bankers. It was the bankers individually behaving irresponsibly. And in the end, it's the behavior of us as individuals which has got to change if we're going to do anything about it. Governments can do things, and I could talk all afternoon, all evening about this. I mean, there is work that governments can do. They can send messages, as we know. They can influence people's behavior. You can give people tax breaks. At the moment, we have a situation in England where it actually pays you to live separately. You get enormously increased social payments if you're living if you're not living and cohabiting. If you marry, after the most enormous battle, the government a few years ago introduced a married person's tax allowance of £200. It was so small that no one took it up. And it was so embarrassingly small, they had to spend almost as much money again on advertising its existence because the people simply weren't interested in £200. However, if you live on social payments, you're £7,000 a year better off if you are not in a stable cohabiting relationship. And of course, that, what we call the couple penalty, fee, everybody knows it. I mean, if you're on social payment, everybody knows that. So not only do they do much better, and that's a lot of money if you're at that level in society, not only is it a far greater payment, but of course there's a lot of misrepresentation going on. People pretend they're living apart when in fact they're not, and that's not healthy either. So the third thing, private enterprise, and that's where we came in. That's the small platoons, as Robert reminded us this afternoon. And what are we doing about it? Well, this is just a quote of something that I said back in 2009 when I was going around hoping that someone else would do this. What I want to see, I said in grand ways in the House of Commons, was a national marriage trust supported by private funds to focus its entire whole activity on this vital area of national life. And I went on saying it, and absolutely nothing happened. And then one day I began to realize that there might be someone up there who was saying, have you got the point yet? You have got to do it. It's your job to do something about this problem. And really, that's where it all started. Now, let me bring you swiftly through some of our recent research. We have recently produced a paper which has produced what we call our top 10 research findings in the first 5 years. There are a lot more of them, but these are the basic ones. This is the one I've already told you about. Half the children of our country are living with both birth parents and the other half not. And then, as I say, we've already talked about those figures, and there they are illustrated. Cohabitation is the main driver of family breakdown. As you see, the blue line is the cohabitants, the red line is the married, and you see the decrease in the rate of breakdown amongst the married and a huge increase in the cohabiting population. This is important. This is the marriage. This is the gap that's opening up between the young and the more mature, about showing the extent to which marriage is becoming less and less popular. And the chances, we have this big gap between people who, if you're 60 or over, you're 95% likely to have got married or be married at some point in your life. That has now fallen right down, and if you're in your 20s now, that is, it is nothing like that figure. As you see, it's falling right down to 25-20% for women and men. That is very, very worrying. Perhaps as worrying, and I think something that's been illustrated very well in this country too, although perhaps not by reference to income, is that marriage is now an institution that's confined to the better off. There was a time, not very long ago, certainly within my lifetime, when everybody married. There wasn't any discussion about it because there was no cohabitation. You wanted to live, you wanted to form a permanent relationship, you got married. It didn't matter where you came in the social pecking order, we all got married. Indeed, in England, I would go further and say that the need to have a formalized, stable marriage before you had children, if you lived in the poorer parts in the north of England, was absolutely vital. I mean, it was completely impermissible for you to live unmarried at that time. What has happened? And so society as a whole was cohesive. Everybody got married. What has happened over the last 50 years is that the poorest in our society no longer get married. And it's now down to about 22%. And indeed, if you go onto the poorer housing estates in parts of England, it's much lower than 20%. Marriage is something that happens in the celebrity magazines. It's not any longer regarded as relevant to the lives of young women and their children. And of course, it means that we have this huge gap opening in society. The better off, the sort of people in this room, they're marrying in exactly the same numbers as their parents and their grandparents did, but the less well-off are no longer marrying in anything like those sort of numbers, and we have this huge gap opening up. In the US, you have the same problem, but the division is not by income, it's more by education, and as the divide is between high school and college education, college-educated people, and this has been pointed out by some of your best sociologists. And people say, why has marriage become such a toxic subject to discuss? And I'll tell you why. It's because it's become a class issue. It was never a class issue. Everybody got married, so everybody was perfectly happy to talk about marriage. You can't talk about marriage if the better off are the only people who do it. Because to do that is to be immediately described as judgmental. And of course, the politicians are terrified to talk about the importance of marriage because most of the electorate, the vast majority of the electorate, are the people who vote for them are not married. So we have this position where you now don't talk about marriage, do you? And this is what was being said this afternoon, and it's terribly, terribly worrying and dangerous. I've shown you this already in another form. Those who cohabit are in the red section and are far more likely to marry, to break up. Now this is Spencer's big moment. This was research that he and our research director did, buried in the depths of Somerset countryside for a week in 2016, and they came up with this amazing finding. And it's the first research, I believe, that we have which shows that it does make a difference to your children's well-being in terms of their self-esteem if their parents are married or not. We never thought this. This arose completely unexpectedly. They weren't looking for it particularly. But there is a measurable difference between the self-esteem, in other words, the way young people think about themselves if their parents are married or cohabiting. Why is that? There are lots of theories, but I think it's about what children pick up in the security of their married parents, which gives them a sense of security that they simply do not have, however apparently secure the relationship may be. This was an interesting piece of research which shows that in fact most people, even if they do break up, were not in fact miserable a year earlier. There's this great myth that there's masses of high conflict family breakdown around, and that it's all these poor people can't be expected to stay together. Now this is a slide that shows you what the position is 10 years on. They are asked. They were asked whether they were happy that they'd stayed in the relationship, even though they had been unhappy at an earlier period in their life. And as you see from the green sections, the overwhelming number of people said that 10 years on, even though they'd been through a bad patch, they were in fact far better off and much happier having stayed together. And this is very important because we say that this is one of the key problems is that people think the answer to their problems is to split up their relationships, and it isn't. Again, staying in an unhappy marriage, in fact, is probably the best thing you can do. Mend it, don't end it, is one of our early slogans. And this is something for the women in the audience. Occasional date nights boost marriage. We launched this last year during Marriage Week. There is some evidence that if you, as a married couple, occasionally make the effort to have a date night and go out with your other half, it does make a difference to the stability of your relationship. You don't want to do it too often, so don't panic, men. It's all right. You don't have to do it too often, but just occasionally, perhaps in a more random way, but on a fairly regular basis, you take the trouble to have a date night. It does seem to boost the security of your marriage. Now, just whipping through some of the sort of media penetration we've had. One of the big areas we've been successful in is getting the media to take this subject seriously. And over the course of the last 5 years, we've had hundreds and hundreds of media slots. There were 5 more this morning on the latest statistics. And it is very encouraging for us that whereas before we couldn't get the newspapers in particular to take the subject seriously, they do now. They do now. And the serious newspapers, the Times, the Telegraph, the Sunday Times, do get it. We have very good relationships with the social affairs editors. They wait with interest for our research to come out, and they are beginning to understand what the problems are. Even the dear BBC, who wouldn't even look at us when we started, and we regarded as something to do with the Conservative Party probably, and almost certainly dangerously homophobic, and definitely right out to the right of Genghis Khan. They take us seriously now. Why? Because we no longer have this debate about same-sex marriage, strangely. So although most of us disapproved of the change in the legislation. The strange thing is, and I always say, God has the best sense of humour, doesn't he, of us all. The strange thing is that he has turned that actually to his advantage, and we are now finding that because that is no longer flooding the marketplace of ideas, they will now talk about the importance of marriage, and they ask themselves the obvious question: why is it that the same-sex community was so keen to have this opportunity? So it hasn't all been bad. This is some of the more serious stuff that's come from the newspapers. This is a slide that won't be relevant to you people, but this is a slide that we normally print this out and hand it out. You can read off from this what the chances are of you getting divorced depending upon your year of marriage, and you will see the very top one, 1963. If you were married in 1963, the chances of you getting divorced are 0%. If you go to 2015, it's up to 38%. So it's to show the enormous fall-off, as I've already said, in the rate of divorce. As the longer you're married, the longer you're likely to stay married. It has that effect. So that is what we're about. That is why we did it. That is why I decided to leave my post as a High Court judge and devote my efforts in the remaining years I have to doing something about this horrible problem. Our logo is an arch with a cornerstone in the middle, and that was designed by a clever supporter of ours, and it demonstrates the essential strength of marriage. If you're an architect will tell you that an arch of that shape, a round arch of that shape with a cornerstone in the middle, is the strongest known form of architectural design. If you think about it, two pillars, the two married people, if you like, the two individuals, if they are subjected to the winds of the problems of life, they collapse. If the two come together and are joined by the capstone in the middle, you create a structure which is the strongest structure known to architecture. And if you want to avoid being killed in an earthquake, you're told always to sit under an arch of that shape because they are most likely to withstand the chaos. We think that's a very apt picture for the essential strength and validity of marriage. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I want that is the whistle-stop tour. I have given Richard a printed version of this, which has got a great deal more detail in it, and it will find its way eventually, I think, onto your websites and in printed form. This is the essence of our case. This is the essence of what we're about. And if you want to find out anything more or look at any of our research, it's all on the website, which we try to keep up to date. What can you do to help? Please pray for us. We struggle. We have a constant struggle. As like your organization, we are constantly on the lookout for financial support, which is a bore because it distracts us from our work. But on the other hand, it does mean all the time, keeps you on your toes, and it makes sure that you're concentrating on the things that really matter. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes, anybody would like a question?